My name is Mark, a recording angel. I've been observing this earth since the dawn of creation. The Most High has asked me to share my recordings with you. The following are my records of the history of God's true church, down through centuries of oppression, and onward until the promised earth is made new once more, collected in this book, War of the Invisibles, the amazing story of the great controversy. If today's recording contains situations which might be uncomfortable for younger listeners, I will mark the video with the words parental guidance recommended.
Chapter 9, Part 1, Rachel, USA, AD 1843 to 1849. Washington, New Hampshire, 1843. My assignment now was to record the choices and events in the life of a little girl named Rachel, who lived on the east coast of the New World country called the United States. Her family was fairly successful, her father being the chief reporter for a local newspaper. Rachel and her mother attended the Methodist Church, and so did Papa on special occasions like Christmas and Easter, and for funerals or weddings of importance. "Rachel," Mama called, "come set this plate of corn on the table, and then call your Papa and tell him dinner's ready." Rachel breathed in deeply. She loved the smell of hot buttered corn. Carefully setting the heavy plate on the table, she ran to the study. "Papa," she called, "dinner's finally ready." Papa looked up from his writing and wiped the tip of his pen. He chuckled. "You are always hungry, my little one, aren't you?" "Well, right now anyway," Rachel said. "Aren't you?" "Yes," Papa agreed. "Let's go eat." He wiped his hands carefully on his handkerchief. Rachel giggled in spite of herself. Papa was always careful to wipe his pen before putting it away and wiping his hands, but as usual, he had a big ink smear across the side of his nose and onto his cheek. Mama said that writers had ink in their blood, and they were happiest when they had it all over them, too. Rachel wasn't sure about the first part, for when Papa cut his finger, he pretty much bled like anyone else, but he did have ink on him most of the time. As they ate their dinner, Mama asked, "So, what is the big story you're working on this week?" "William Miller," said Papa. "Have you heard of him?" "Yes," said Mama. "He has been giving lectures all along the East Coast in different homes and a few churches. I believe his farm isn't far from our home." "That's true," said Papa. "He lives in Lohampton, New York. He has published a series of his lectures in book form. I have been reviewing it for the paper, and I would like to attend one of his meetings. Would you like to come along? You two usually seem interested in all that religious stuff." "Yes," said Mama, "we would." The next day at school, Rachel sat on the steps with her best friend, Uriah. The other boys played ball after eating their lunches, but Uriah had never been able to walk properly as long as Rachel had known him. He had been treated with calomel for something when he was a very little boy, and it had left his left leg covered with ulcers and crippled. The ulcers seemed to be getting worse, and Uriah had a hard time walking around. He and Rachel had become very close friends and would sit on the steps and talk every day at lunchtime. "Papa's taking us to hear William Miller speak this weekend," Rachel announced. "Really?" Uriah asked. "I heard he has a mental condition and is a little out of touch." Rachel laughed. "Oh, that's what they say about anybody different," she said. "Papa has a copy of his book because he had to write about him for the paper. He might let us borrow it if you would like to look at it." "Sure," said Uriah. "I am interested in how mentally ill people think." Rachel laughed. Uriah was a big tease, but Rachel knew he loved books and would be eager to read anything before forming his final opinion. "I'll ask Papa if I can bring it tomorrow," she said. "Papa says that William Miller believes that Jesus is going to come sometime in the next couple years, and then the end of the world will be here." That perspective has to be a little distressing for some." Rachel nodded. "I suppose so," she said. "I think that I would be very happy to see him, though." "You and me both." Uriah looked down at his leg. "I'd be happy for him to come this afternoon, so I could trade in this leg for one that actually worked. Then you'd have to read books by yourself at noon, because I might have to play ball." Rachel laughed. "I believe if you had two perfect legs, you would still talk to me at lunchtime," she said. Uriah blushed and then mumbled something like, "Yeah, maybe." Rachel was right. Her papa didn't mind her borrowing the book. He was finished with it. She carried the heavy tome to school with her, anxious to share it with Uriah, but Uriah didn't show up. His sister Annie was there, though, and when the teacher finally let them out for lunch, Rachel rushed over to her. "Annie, where's Uriah? Why isn't he here today?" Annie turned her blue eyes to the younger girl. "His leg is worse," she said. "The ulcers are becoming more and more infected. Mama had the doctor come last night because Uriah was crying with the pain. He's given him some new medicine, but he said if the ulcers don't improve soon, they're going to have to take his leg." "Take his leg?" queried Rachel. "You mean cut it off?" Annie nodded. "Won't that kill him?" "I don't know," Annie answered. "Maybe. It sounds awful, but the doctor says he might die if they don't." Rachel felt as if someone had kicked her in the stomach. "Please take this book home to him," she said, "if he feels well enough to read, and tell him I'm praying for him." Annie smiled. "I'll do that, Rachel," she said. "Uriah is practically out of his mind with the pain and his fever right now, but it will mean a lot that you care for him so much." Rachel wandered over to the steps and sat silently where she and Uriah usually sat at lunchtime. "Dear God," she prayed, "please let William Miller be right and let Jesus come quickly, like maybe tonight, so that Uriah's leg won't hurt anymore. And please don't let my friend die." The next day, and the next, Rachel looked for Annie and Uriah at school, but neither were there. She couldn't stand the suspense any longer, and the minute the school bell rang at the end of the day, she hurried to the Smith's house. She had to know what was happening. As she approached the front porch, she could hear low moaning coming from the upstairs bedroom. It made the knot in her stomach feel worse. She stood and listened for a moment, then she timidly tapped on the door. Annie came to the door and slipped out onto the porch. She looked terrible. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was limp and stringy. "Rachel," she said, "come sit down." "Uriah is worse?" she asked. Annie nodded. "The doctor took his leg yesterday," she said. "They cut it off?" "Yes," said Annie. "Did it hurt him?" Rachel asked. Annie rubbed her hands together slowly. "It was awful," she said. "Several of us had to hold him down, and the doctor just cut it off. He's been given something now to help him sleep, but the pain must just be unimaginable. I imagine I can still hear his screaming." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked. "I don't know," Annie said. "We're praying hard that he will be. It depends whether his leg heals or whether the infection still spreads." "Let's pray for him now," Rachel whispered. The two girls held hands and prayed for the boy they both cared about. I wished they could see the guardians pulling close over his bed and bringing rest to the fevered boy. The Almighty had already shared with us that He had serious plans for this child, but for now, Rachel and Annie would just have to trust. "Oh, Annie," cried Rachel, "the meetings were good. I wish you could have come with me. Mr. Miller is quite a Bible scholar. He has things all figured out, from Daniel and Revelation and all those confusing books with all those numbers and beasts and everything, and it just makes so much sense when he explains it." "Explain it to me," Annie begged. "I can't," Rachel said. I don't really understand all the math, except that when he preached it, I really believed it, and I am just sure that Jesus is coming soon." "Did he say exactly when?" Annie asked. "It would be so nice to know when." "No, he just said sometime around 1843. But that's now. It could be any time now." "Oh, that would be wonderful," Annie exclaimed. "How is Uriah doing?" asked Rachel. "He's getting better," said Annie. "I gave him your book, and he glanced at it a little, although he's still quite tired and weak from his operation. And he still sleeps a lot from the laudanum the doctor gave him for pain, but I'm going to start reading it to him when he's awake. Uriah is such an intellectual. He will really enjoy that stuff, and he'll probably understand the math." The two girls laughed. I chuckled. Uriah would understand the math, and he would enjoy the book. I knew that it would be only a matter of weeks before the entire Smith family would become as excited about the Lord's coming as Rachel was. The band of Millerites was growing so fast that William Miller was no longer the only speaker. Many speakers were traveling and spreading the word, and the little group of believers had grown to 50,000. Many were considered fanatics and were disfellowshipped from the churches they belonged to. Yet with the prospect of Jesus' coming and taking them home soon, they were able to take these things in stride and were filled with joy and anticipation. Ascension Rock, Miller's Farm, October 22, 1844.
Papa, Papa, wake up! Today's the day Jesus is coming.
It isn't even morning yet, Papa groaned.
Sure it is, Rachel said. It's just not light, but we don't want to be late. What if he comes at the crack of dawn?
It's possible. God is an early riser, you know. All of his creatures seem to be. Then there's the owl and the bat and...
Oh, Papa, Rachel scolded. Come on. You said you would take me over to the Miller's farm today.
Yes, I did, Papa said. Go get ready. Your mother and I will be down soon.
Rachel scampered back to her room. Jesus was coming today. What more could anybody possibly want? She pulled on her clothes and ran downstairs.
Mama was excited too. Papa said he was coming along only to cover the story for the newspaper. I'll drive you two as far as Mr. Miller's farm, he promised. The Lord will have to take you the rest of the way. He knows I'm pretty much just a New Hampshire boy.
Oh, come on, Papa, come with us, they cried.
I'll stay with you at Miller's farm and see what happens, Papa promised.
Rachel and Mama had been praying and praying that Papa would be ready and want to go to heaven with them, but so far he insisted he was there just to cover the news. Well, that's good, Mama said. The Lord is going to give him some pretty amazing stuff to cover.
It was not yet light when they reached Miller's farm, but it was already crowded. Papa found a place to unhitch the horse, while Mama and Rachel walked through the crowds looking for friends. Out near the big flat rock on Miller's farm, Rachel found Annie and Uriah.
I'm so glad you two could get here early, she said. This is going to be just wonderful.
Yes, Uriah answered. I wouldn't miss it for anything. After all, I'm waiting for my new leg.
They all laughed.
It's good to see you up and around, Uriah, Rachel said.
He smiled. I felt a deep heaviness as I hovered near the children. They were so excited, so joyful to be seeing their king soon. Already I was feeling the pain they would soon be feeling. Would they be able to rise above it? Would these young ones be able to understand why William Miller was allowed to have misunderstood this prophecy? I didn't know. The guardians looked anxious too, and they were gathered in large numbers. Their services were not needed yet, but they would be shortly, and the guardians were ready.
I'm glad to be up and around again, too, Uriah said. Although if Jesus had come last summer when we first thought he might, I would still have 2 legs. You'll have another one by tonight, Annie teased. When you look back after 5,000 or 6,000 years, 1 year without a leg won't seem like much. That's true, laughed Uriah. In the perspective of eternity, I guess 1 human year is really not much.
I nodded, even though they couldn't see me. 1 human year wasn't much, but I also knew that to these young people, 1 human year could seem like an eternity. The little group sang and prayed. Some were anxious and tearful, searching their minds for any unconfessed sins they might have. Others were too excited at the prospect of seeing their king to spend any time in tears. The day wore on. As those awaiting Christ's return watched and waited, sang and visited, Rachel's father worked his way through the crowd, chatting and making notes. Occasionally he looked nervously toward the sky. He was not a believer, but occasionally he wondered what would happen if Jesus really did come that day. I could tell his heart was torn between hoping nothing would happen to confirm his stand on the issue, and hoping that his wife and daughter would not be ridiculed and disappointed. Already there had been division in every church that the Millerite message had been preached. Those who loved the Almighty were thrilled at the thought of seeing him soon, while those who did not love him as much as they professed were not interested in seeing him any time in the near future. Not only did they show a lack of excitement over the prospect of his coming, but they opposed those who were spreading the good news. There were stories of those who had been disfellowshipped from their churches. One young Millerite had been encouraged and thrilled at the idea of Jesus' soon coming, and she spoke her testimony in a meeting and gave Jesus the glory for relieving her depression and giving her such encouragement. The minister said,
"And this encouragement was brought about by your belief in Methodism?"
No, she said, it's not Methodism. It's not because I'm a Methodist. This is because Jesus is coming soon.
The minister was so angry that she was disfellowshipped from the church and had to worship with others like her in local homes.
The guardians and I were horrified at the lack of respect shown for our king and for those who loved him by the very people who claimed to be his shepherds. I knew that no matter how bad it had been before today, tomorrow would be worse. Rachel's father was talking to Mr. Hastings, a farmer from New Ipswich.
"Well, sir," he said, "my potatoes are still in the ground. I saw no point in using my precious time to dig 'em up when I'm going to be eating at Christ's table for dinner. Besides, the crops were disappointing to those who did harvest theirs this year. The potato blight has been terrible. Almost all the potatoes in our community were of very poor quality and of no use at all. While we would use what we could in our homes, they wouldn't be sellable. I'd much rather go to heaven and eat ambrosia and fruit from the tree of life. I don't care what it is. Anything will be better than blighted potatoes anyhow."
Rachel's father laughed. "But what if Jesus doesn't come today?" Mr. Hastings shrugged.
"I haven't even devoted time to that thought," he confided. "He is coming, and I'm going home. Who wants to worry about what-ifs?"
Rachel's father nodded, made a few more notes in his book, and moved on to the next person. He had enough material for several feature articles already. Today had been very good for business. He glanced at the sky again. Red streaks with bands of blue and gold made a beautiful picture, but it was just the sunset. Soon darkness fell, and still Jesus had not come. It was past midnight, yet the 10-year-old still tossed in her bed. Finally, she got up and walked to the window to look out at the stars. "Why didn't you come, Jesus? We loved you so much. We were so excited to see you. Did you forget us?" As her glance lowered, she realized a light was shining out from the window of the parlor downstairs. Wiping her eyes, she went to investigate. The stairs creaked as she padded down on her bare feet. Opening the door to the parlor, she discovered Papa. He was sitting at the desk writing. He turned to face his little daughter, noting her blotchy face and red swollen eyes. "You're up awfully late, sweetheart," he said. "I couldn't sleep, Papa," Rachel answered. Papa smiled sympathetically. "It was a hard day for you and your mama." Rachel nodded. "I don't understand what happened," she said. "How could he have forgotten us? Did we not understand the prophecy right, or does he just not love us?" "Not love you?" said Papa. "Of course he loves you." His tone was much sharper than he intended, and he reached out and scooped his daughter close in his arms. "How could he not love you?" he whispered. "You're one of his most loyal followers. Any God who would disappoint you like that is not worth following, in my opinion." I watched silently. While his words were harsh, I knew that he was still filled with indecision, weighing one side against the other, and his words were influenced more by his protective anger over his daughter's broken heart than true hostility toward the Almighty. God would understand that even better than I, for he too is protective of the feelings of his children, and his heart was breaking along with theirs at their sadness. The other recorders and I had carefully kept track of every insult and every indignity that his friends had experienced while waiting for him to come, and we were going to continue, for he plans to make it up to them. "Papa," Rachel asked, "do you suppose the disciples felt like this the night after Jesus was crucified?" Papa looked down at her in surprise. Well, I suppose so," he admitted. "They would have been very shocked and disappointed. Weren't they expecting him to be crowned king instead?" "Mm-hmm," Rachel said. "Maybe we just didn't understand what was happening here. Maybe things happen according to God's plan, and we just misunderstood what the plan was." Papa smoothed his hair with his inky hands. "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps not, but whatever the case, you know that I love you, Rachel." "I love you too, Papa," she said. "Now go back to bed, honey. I have to have an article ready for the paper in the morning, and I'll be writing a lot on this. I'm going to go back to New Ipswich in a couple of days and find that farmer, Mr. Hastings, who never harvested his potatoes. I want to see what he has to say now, and I may be doing some other traveling through New England for some feature articles on this. If you want to go with me, I'm sure your mama could spare you for a few days, and you could find out what some of the other Millerites are thinking. Would you like that?" "Oh, yes," Rachel answered. "I really would. Maybe somebody will be able to explain some of this so that it makes more sense." "Maybe," Papa said, "if anything about the Millerite movement made any sense. In the meantime, you get some sleep, and I'll finish this article." Rachel hugged her papa again and headed back upstairs. Her guardian hovered close and covered her with his wings so that the cloud of depression hovering in her room couldn't touch her, and she fell into an exhausted slumber. Washington, New Hampshire, November 1, 1844.
"Hey, Uriah!"
Rachel called as she ran toward the house.
"I'm out here on the front porch,"
Uriah shouted back. Rachel rounded the corner and slowed to a more dignified walk.
"I brought you something," she said.
"Really?" said Uriah. "From New Ipswich?"
"Yes. What is it?"
Uriah asked, reaching out his hand. Rachel pulled a large potato from the pocket of her dress and held it out to him.
"It looks like a potato,"
said the 16-year-old.
"I always knew you were a genius," Rachel said, giggling. "That's never been in question," Uriah teased. "But tell me, is this a special potato?"
"Well, look at it," Rachel advised. Uriah turned it over and over in his hands. It was a very large potato, and it looked like a healthy one.
"This potato's from New Ipswich?"
he asked.
"Yes."
"I give up," he said.
"Tell me what's special about this potato."
"Well, a genius you may be," Rachel observed, "but a farmer you're not." Uriah nodded.
"So?"
"Remember Papa's article last week in the paper?"
"Yes," said Uriah. "I think your Papa believes we're a bunch of fools."
"Well, my Papa's a kind man. It's just that he's a reporter, and he works for a newspaper that isn't very sympathetic to us Millerites. But remember what he said about Mr. Hastings and how he hadn't dug up any of his potatoes? This is a Hastings potato."
"Ah," commented Uriah. "So I have a nice, respectable Millerite potato here."
Rachel laughed. "It's more than that. Remember in the article that Papa said all the potato crops up and down New England had the blight?"
"Oh, that's right,"
Uriah said as understanding dawned across his face. I couldn't help chuckling. These humans are so amusing to watch, especially when they have just caught on. Uriah lit up with a huge smile now.
I don't see much blight on this one. This is probably the most enormous potato in New England, and it's healthy looking too."
"Exactly," Rachel said. "Mr. Hastings and his family went out and dug up their potato crop after the disappointment last week. He gave them something to do instead of sitting home feeling miserable as we did. All of his potatoes are like this. He gave Papa a whole huge bag of them to bring home. Papa put one on the desk of everybody at the newspaper office, and Mama has been fixing them for us at home. We're going to have some for dinner. We're going to have the most wonderful potatoes in all of New England. Jesus may not have come last week, and Mr. Hastings may have been late in harvesting his potatoes, but God protected his potatoes from the blight. Look at them. Aren't they awesome?" Uriah nodded slowly.
"God is really good."
"We must have misunderstood something." "Well, you know," Rachel said, "I've been thinking about this, and there have been people in the Bible who didn't understand what was going on either. Job couldn't figure out why he was having such a hard time, and God didn't hold that against him for not understanding. Job just always insisted that God was good no matter how confusing things were, and that's what I'm going to do. I don't understand what happened last week, and I don't understand why Jesus didn't come and get us, but I believe God is good, and I'm just going to have to hang on to that." Uriah nodded.
"You make a lot of sense for a little 10-year-old, he said.
I smiled too. It wouldn't be the first time that a younger person had been used to strengthen the faith of others. And Rachel was right. The Almighty counts loyalty among his followers much higher than intellectual gymnastics and being able to explain every single thing.
This broadcast has come from the book War of the Invisibles by Sally Pierson Dillon, with permission from the Review and Herald Publishing Association. This book and the rest of the series, War of the Ages, can be purchased by going to www.adventistbookcenter.com or by calling 1-800-765-6955. I'm your narrator, Austin Backus, and this audio project is a gift to you from my free Christian book ministry, RXF 1888. Please visit our website, www.rxf1888.com, to request free Christian books for both kids and adults. And join us here again for more stories from Mark the Recording Angel.